Imagine trusting someone completely, believing they're, the answer to your deepest desires, the missing piece to your life's puzzle. Now imagine that profound trust being weaponized in the most chilling, calculated way imaginable, turning those very hopes into a fatal snare. Today we're taking a deep dive into a story that really exposes the dark underbelly of human deception, a truly harrowing tale. It leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about appearances and the intricate webs of vulnerability that can exist within society.
Absolutely. And our mission for this deep dive is, well, to understand far more than just the horrific what of these events. We're dissecting the how and the why, peeling back the layers of a meticulously crafted pattern of betrayal and vulnerability. A pattern that allowed one man to operate with such cold precision for far too long. We're talking about the shocking story of Mohan Kumar, a man who, despite his outwardly unremarkable life, became infamously known as the Cyanide Killer.
That's right. And this isn't just about a string of brutal crimes, although it certainly is that. It's about a man who systematically twisted the most fundamental human desires, love, security, companionship, the yearning for a family, twisted them into a fatal trap. We'll explore in detail how trust itself can become a weapon, how deeply ingrained societal structures and cultural norms can inadvertently leave people incredibly vulnerable, and the meticulous, terrifying calculation behind the murders of at least 20 young women. This isn't merely a crime report. It's a profound examination of lives stolen, families shattered, and the lingering human cost that continues to echo through communities even today.
Indeed, the human element here is absolutely paramount. It compels us to confront how a seemingly ordinary individual could inflict such widespread devastation, and what that tells us not just about the dark corners of human nature, but also about the hidden dangers that can lurk beneath the veneer of normalcy, especially when societal pressures create an environment that's just ripe for exploitation. It's a sobering and essential exploration.
Okay, let's unpack this then, and immediately confront the profound contradiction right at the heart of this story. The man we're about to delve into wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, not a monster that society would instinctively recoil from. Far from it. His name was Mohan Kumar Vivekananda, born in 1963 in a small, pretty conservative village nestled in the heart of Karnataka, India. His early life, by all accounts, appeared remarkably, almost impressively, unremarkable. Son of a farmer, modest circumstances, yet consistently described as bright, disciplined, highly respectful, the quintessential model student, really.
And it's precisely this stark contrast that makes his later actions so deeply disturbing. This was a man who, by every outward measure, seemed to embody societal ideals. He excelled in academics, right? He pursued a respected profession. He became a primary school teacher, a role traditionally associated with nurturing, guiding, shaping young minds. He married, had 3 children, lived in a small, unassuming house. The public persona he projected was one of stability, responsibility, trustworthiness. This isn't just a minor discrepancy. It's a complete, almost theatrical disconnect between his public identity and the chilling internal world that was clearly developing beneath that surface.
So how does a person with such an ordinary, even respectable facade transform into the Cyanide Killer? I mean, what's the very first thing we need to grasp about this contradiction?
Well, what's truly fascinating and terrifying is how that ordinary facade masked a deeply ingrained manipulative streak. It was a skill he would hone to devastating effect as his life progressed. This duality, this meticulous construction of a believable, benign identity, specifically to disarm his targets. It's highly characteristic of individuals who engage in calculated predatory behavior. They're not driven by impulsive rage. They are strategists. They understand precisely how to exploit perception and trust.
It's genuinely terrifying to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
So by the early 2000s, something fundamental shifted in him. This man, who had once stood in front of classrooms, guiding eager young students, resigned from his teaching job. He started drifting, taking on a series of odd jobs, running small businesses, dabbling in various schemes that never really amounted to anything substantial. It was during this period we learned that his chilling double life truly began to solidify and take root. What was driving him during this transition? What was the core motivation?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really raises an important question. What happens when ordinary discontent isn't just felt, but actively acted upon in the most extreme, self-serving ways imaginable? You see, unlike the stereotypical serial killer often driven by, say, sexual deviance or profound psychological torment, Mohan Kumar's motivation seems almost mundane, yet insidiously destructive. He was deeply dissatisfied. Dissatisfied with his life, his financial standing, his perceived lack of control. He simply wanted more. More money, more control, more excitement. This isn't the kind of profound psychological pathology listeners might typically associate with serial killers, not rage or psychosis in the usual sense, but a simple, profound dissatisfaction that, when coupled with a complete absence of empathy, just metastasized into something truly horrific.
Right, so his underlying dissatisfaction, combined with that utter lack of empathy, became the sort of genesis of the greed and ego that would define his crimes. It's a chilling progression, isn't it? He started seeing the world and other people essentially as resources to fulfill his own desires, rather than as individuals with their own lives, their own worth.
Precisely. His desire for more wasn't tempered by any moral compass, any sense of right or wrong, or any concern whatsoever for the well-being of others. It simply morphed into this unbridled drive to take whatever he wanted, regardless of the devastating cost to human lives. This transitions from a seemingly normal person to a calculated predatory criminal is, well, it's a profound reminder of how quickly seemingly benign traits like ambition or dissatisfaction can become utterly destructive when they're completely unchecked by a conscience. He was operating in total moral vacuum.
And here's where it gets really interesting and truly disturbing. His victims weren't random. This wasn't a killer lashing out indiscriminately at all. No, Mohan Kumar meticulously selected them. He preyed on their most profound hopes and their deep-seated vulnerabilities. He had a very specific type, a clear profile he sought out. Most of his victims were young women, typically between the ages of 18 and 30. They almost universally came from poor or lower middle-class families, and critically, almost all of them were single women facing immense, often overwhelming societal pressure to marry.
That last point is absolutely crucial to understanding his effectiveness as a predator. He possessed an almost uncanny understanding of the societal fabric, particularly the expectations placed upon these young women in traditional Indian society. Their vulnerability wasn't just about their economic status, it was profoundly intertwined with the intense social and familial pressure to find a husband, to secure their future, and importantly, to uphold their family's honor. This made them incredibly susceptible to a charlatan's promises of a stable, respectable marriage. They were actively looking for exactly what he pretended to offer.
Exactly. And he found them through various insidious methods, demonstrating his careful planning. Sometimes it was through matrimonial ads placed in local newspapers, where families would explicitly be looking for a suitable match for their daughters. Other times he would infiltrate social circles, being introduced through acquaintances, shrewdly posing as a respectable matchmaker, or even as a potential groom himself. And then there were the direct approaches, at public places like temples or bustling bus stops, where he would observe, identify, and then charmingly initiate contact with his targets. What's chilling is the sheer depth of deception he employed. We heard from one victim's sister who later said, "He was so polite, we never imagined he could harm her. He seemed like someone who would take care of her." This isn't the image of a lurking threat, is it? It's the meticulously crafted picture of someone who cultivated an appearance of trustworthiness, kindness, respectability.
Precisely to disarm and lure. No, it absolutely isn't the typical image. And this wasn't impulsive behavior either. It was a deeply ingrained, almost ritualistic process of grooming. Weeks, sometimes even months, were meticulously spent weaving this dense, intricate web of false promises, making the victim believe she had genuinely found her ideal partner, her secure future. He understood exactly what these vulnerable women and their families were seeking: love, marriage, a home, a family, social acceptance. He would paint these vivid pictures of their future together, talking about buying a house, starting a family, creating a life of stability and happiness. He'd sound utterly convincing, playing into every hope and dream they held.
Think about that level of psychological manipulation. Just meticulous. He crafted this illusion, preying on their most fundamental human desires. Then he'd escalate the deception, persuading them to elope. He'd tell them that their families would never agree to the match, maybe citing caste differences, financial disparities, or just the perceived stubbornness of their parents. This created a sense of urgency and exclusivity, right? Further isolating them from their existing support systems and making them entirely reliant on him. And here's where his primary motive, his sheer greed, truly manifested. He insisted they bring all their jewelry and savings for their new life together. He demanded their most precious possessions, their financial security, and their complete unconditional trust, all under the guise of love and commitment. It's not just a violation. It's an utterly cynical weaponization of trust.
Oh, absolutely. The elopement ruse was a brilliantly sinister component of his strategy. By convincing them to leave their homes with all their valuables, he achieved multiple objectives simultaneously. Firstly, he isolated them completely from their family and friends, severing their support networks. That's critical. Secondly, he stripped them of financial means, making them completely dependent on him. And crucially, by having them elope, he created a ready-made narrative for their disappearance that deflected immediate suspicion away from him. It made it appear as if the women had willingly run off, taking their belongings, which often delayed proper investigations by weeks or even months. This initial misdirection was key to his longevity as a killer.
Then came the ultimate unthinkable betrayal. Once he had isolated the victim and secured her valuables, the horrifying climax of his method would unfold. He would take them to a bus station or a lodge in a different city, often claiming it was just a stop on their journey to their new life together. There, he would tell the victim they needed to take a contraceptive pill before they could consummate the marriage, often citing cultural reasons or a desire to ensure a planned family. This was a final, sickening layer of deception, playing on the intimacy and perceived commitment of their relationship. But the pill. It was no contraceptive. It was potassium cyanide, a fast-acting deadly poison. The grim details are truly horrifying. Cyanide kills quickly, often within minutes. It causes convulsions, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, essentially preventing the body's cells from using oxygen.
And the bathroom trap in a public restroom. It was nothing short of genius in its depravity and cold calculation. It provided the perfect, anonymous cover for the act itself. The privacy of the stall allowed him to administer the poison without witnesses, right? While the public setting of a bus station or lodge restroom ensured he could quickly slip away into the bustling crowd, leaving the victim to collapse in relative anonymity. This setup minimized suspicion and maximized his opportunity for a swift escape with the stolen valuables. His success for nearly a decade was precisely because of the cleverness of this method. There was no direct evidence linking him to the deaths, no fingerprints from a struggle, no clear motive apparent at the immediate scene. The public setting meant no one saw the actual crime take place, and cyanide, being a quick-acting poison that dissipates fairly rapidly, leaves minimal traces, especially if autopsies were rushed or, as was often the case, not performed meticulously at all given those initial assumptions of suicide or elopement. This meticulous planning allowed him to operate for almost 10 years without being identified as a serial killer.
It's hard to truly grasp the scale of the tragedy without humanizing it, isn't it? Behind the cold statistics of 20 victims are real lives, real dreams, brutally extinguished. These weren't just numbers. They were young women with aspirations, families, futures that were stolen from them. Let's try and bring their stories into focus a bit more.
Absolutely, it's crucial. Each woman was a unique individual, yet they shared that common thread of vulnerability that Mohan Kumar ruthlessly exploited.
Take Shobha, for instance. She was just 19 years old, full of life, ambition. Her dream was to become a nurse, a path she saw as her ticket to a better life, not just for herself, but for her family too. She had painstakingly saved up every single rupee to pay for her training fees, a significant sacrifice for her poor family. Mohan Kumar, with his false promises of marriage and a stable future, lured her away. She disappeared after leaving home with those precious savings money that represented her entire future. Just gone.
And her dreams. Then there was Jyothi, who was 23. As the eldest daughter, she carried immense pressure, a heavy weight of responsibility to marry and fulfill her family's expectations. Often, that included providing financial stability or comfort. She met Mohan through a seemingly trustworthy mutual contact, believed his convincing promises, and was later found dead. Her family was completely bewildered, no explanation initially given for her demise. Her hopes for a life fulfilling her family's expectations were just callously crushed.
And of course, Anitha, who was 22 years old. Her tragic death ultimately sparked the investigation that led to Mohan's capture, but not before her own hopes were extinguished, just like the others. She had just completed her studies and, like so many young women her age, simply wanted to settle down, marry, start a family. She was at that pivotal point in her life, looking forward to a future she believed was within her grasp, only to fall prey to Mohan's cruel deception.
Each of these women had distinct personalities, unique aspirations, deeply cherished dreams, and each was specifically targeted, not randomly, but because they were navigating these intense societal pressures and expectations. That made them incredibly susceptible to a charlatan's promises. Mohan Kumar exploited these deeply ingrained social vulnerabilities, turning their most earnest hopes into his deadly advantage. It's a pattern we unfortunately see repeated across cultures where such pressures exist, making it easier for predators to identify and manipulate victims who are genuinely just seeking a brighter future.
But the tragedy, it didn't just end with their deaths, did it? The families of these victims were left not just with this profound, debilitating grief, but with an agonizing additional layer of suffering, profound guilt, and unanswered questions. It's heartbreaking to hear the accounts. One victim's father later recounted with immense sorrow. "We thought she had abandoned us. We even cursed her, believing she had run away with a lover, bringing shame upon our family. Now we know she was betrayed, murdered in cold blood. That guilt, that feeling that we misjudged and condemned her, will never leave us." Can you even imagine that psychological torment?
It's unbearable.
The belief that your daughter had willingly left you, only to discover she was murdered, her innocence stolen.
And this element is absolutely crucial to understanding how Mohan Kumar managed to operate for so long, almost undetected. The initial assumption of elopement or abandonment, coupled with the intense societal stigma surrounding women who run away to marry, it meant that families were incredibly reluctant to push for deeper investigations. There was a profound sense of shame, a desperate desire to avoid scandal, and, well, a tragic lack of suspicion that something far more sinister had occurred. This pervasive societal reaction inadvertently aided the killer. It provided him with invaluable time and cover, allowing Mohan to evade detection and continue his horrific crimes for years. The absence of a clear crime scene, the victim's perceived willing departure with valuables, the quick-acting poison, it all conspired to ensure that authorities initially dismissed these deaths as suicides or simple disappearances, tragically delaying the realization that a chilling pattern existed.
It's a devastating cycle, really. Societal vulnerability feeding individual depravity. But thankfully, the pattern did eventually begin to unravel. It all started in September 2009 with Anitha's death in the bustling coastal town of Mangalore. Initially, her death was heartbreakingly assumed to be suicide, a tragic but sadly not uncommon occurrence for young women facing social or economic difficulties in India. But something about the scene bothered investigators, a nagging doubt that wouldn't let them just dismiss it so easily.
Those nagging doubts were critical. There was no suicide note, which you often find in such cases. More puzzling, her valuable jewelry was missing, though her other belongings were untouched. That seemed incredibly odd for a suicide. And the chosen location inside a crowded bus station restroom didn't seem like the private, solitary place someone would typically choose to end their life. When police pressed Anitha's grieving family for more information, they learned something chilling that fundamentally altered their perspective. She had met a man recently who promised to marry her, had asked her to bring all her jewelry and savings for their new life together, and she had indeed eloped with him just a day earlier. Now, this young woman, full of hope, was dead. This detail, the missing jewelry, combined with the elopement story that was the first thread that truly began to pull apart the killer's perfectly constructed facade. It transformed what seemed like an isolated tragic event into a crucial clue in a much larger, much more sinister puzzle. It was the crucial deviation from the typical suicide narrative that compelled them to dig deeper.
Exactly. Suddenly, Anitha's death wasn't an isolated incident at all. It was a potential piece of a much larger, terrifying mosaic. Police, now alert to the subtle but disturbing discrepancies, began an urgent and meticulous review of old, unsolved cases across Karnataka. And as they did, disturbing similarities began to emerge, not just in a few cases, but in scores of them. The commonalities were chilling. All victims young, single women. All had died in public places like bus stops or lodges. Cyanide had been found in some of the bodies where proper autopsies were performed. And crucially, jewelry and valuables were consistently missing from every single victim. It was an undeniable, terrifying signature, the signature of a serial killer. This horrifying realization led to the urgent formation of Operation Cyanide, a dedicated task force created specifically to track this elusive and terrifying killer who had operated with impunity for so long.
This was undeniably a race against time. The investigators now knew they were dealing with a cunning serial killer who was replicating his exact deadly method, and with each passing day, another unsuspecting woman could become a victim. The pressure to connect the remaining dots, to act swiftly, and to prevent further tragedies would have been immense, a palpable weight on their shoulders. The realization that multiple, seemingly disparate tragedies were in fact linked by a single cold-blooded predator must have created a profound sense of urgency within the investigative teams, shifting their focus from solving individual cases to dismantling an ongoing systematic killing spree. They needed a breakthrough, and fast.
And the breakthrough finally came. Not from a physical clue, but from the digital breadcrumbs of a predator who genuinely believed he was invisible.
It came from Anita's phone records. A specific name kept appearing in her call logs, a name that would soon become synonymous with terror throughout Karnataka: Mohan Kumar. Surveillance teams were deployed immediately, working around the clock, and what they discovered was horrifyingly consistent with their fears. Mohan was already in contact with another unsuspecting woman, using the exact same marriage promises, weaving the same web of charming lies, preparing to enact his deadly ritual once more. The police knew they had to intervene immediately. Before another life was taken, they had their target. Now they just needed to set the perfect trap to apprehend him and bring his reign of terror to an end. The tension at that moment must have been absolutely palpable.
And the meticulous police work here, particularly the diligent analysis of phone records, really highlights the critical importance of forensic data in uncovering patterns of serial crime. It was no longer about a single isolated incident, but about identifying the digital footprint of a predator who genuinely believed he was undetectable. The immediate need for intervention upon discovering he was already grooming another victim underscores the extreme gravity of their mission. They couldn't afford to wait. They had to act, and act decisively, to prevent yet another tragedy from unfolding. This was the culmination of countless hours of dedicated, painstaking investigative work, all coming down to a single critical moment.
So, in October 2009, after weeks of relentless investigation and surveillance, the police finally sprung their trap. They moved with precision and urgency. They arrested Mohan Kumar while he was actually meeting his next unsuspecting victim, preventing yet another life from being brutally extinguished by his hands. At first, he was eerily calm, almost disarmingly so, denying everything, trying to maintain that innocent, respectable facade he had so meticulously crafted over the years. But as the weight of the evidence began to pile up, irrefutable call records connecting him to victims, chilling witness testimonies from families and potential victims who had narrowly escaped, and the undeniable links to his specific cyanide purchases, his composure finally cracked.
Right. And during interrogation, Mohan finally confessed in chilling, almost clinical detail. He explained his entire modus operandi, from how he routinely bought potassium cyanide from unsuspecting goldsmiths, casually claiming it was for polishing jewelry, which is actually a common practice in that profession, providing him cover to his cold preference for public restrooms as the location for his crimes. He even took police to the various crime scenes, pointing out where he had left each victim, almost as if he were recounting a mundane itinerary or providing directions to a business transaction. It's unnerving. One investigator later recalled, "He spoke about the murders like he was describing a business transaction. There was no emotion, no remorse, not even a hint of understanding the enormity of what he had done." This profound lack of emotion during confession is a hallmark characteristic of psychopathy. It's not just a lack of remorse, it's an inability to even comprehend the gravity of their actions in an emotional sense. To him, these were just efficient transactions, a means to an end, with human lives as mere disposable objects in his pursuit of financial gain and ego gratification.
It's genuinely difficult to wrap your head around such a profound absence of human feeling. Just cold. Mohan Kumar was ultimately charged with 20 counts of murder, along with theft and criminal conspiracy. The trial was long, complex, and emotionally harrowing. A torturous journey for everyone involved, especially the surviving families. Many family members of the victims testified, recounting in agonizing detail how Mohan had charmed his way into their lives, how he had promised a bright future for their daughters, only to destroy them in the most brutal and cynical way imaginable. In 2013, a special court sentenced him to death by hanging, a verdict that was later upheld by the Karnataka High Court and finally, unanimously by the Supreme Court of India in 2017. The Supreme Court's ruling was damning. It left absolutely no room for ambiguity or leniency.
The court's language there is exceptionally powerful and telling, isn't it? It explicitly acknowledges not just the sheer number of victims, but the very nature of his crimes, the weaponized trust and cold precision with which he operated as defining factors demanding the ultimate penalty. This judicial determination underscores society's complete condemnation of a criminal who systematically exploited the most vulnerable members of the community by twisting their deepest desires against them. It speaks to the profound violation of trust that characterized every one of his horrifying acts and the absolute necessity of holding him accountable for the widespread devastation he wrought.
So who was Mohan Kumar truly? What drove this man, a former teacher, a family man, seemingly so ordinary, to such calculated, systematic depravity? It's the question that haunts anyone who delves into his story.
Well, psychologists who studied him extensively concluded he was, without a doubt, a psychopath. And this isn't just a casual label. It defines a specific and dangerous cluster of traits. A profound and unshakable lack of empathy, an almost uncanny manipulative nature, a desperate and pervasive need for control over others, and a primary driving motive of financial gain. Unlike some serial killers who are driven by, say, sexual gratification or profound rage or even delusions, Mohan's motive was fundamentally rooted in greed. He wanted money, specifically the jewelry and savings of his victims, which he then quickly pawned or spent.
So while the financial gain was his immediate objective, there was something else at play too, wasn't there? The psychological satisfaction he derived from his cunning, from getting away with it.
Absolutely. While greed was primary, the pleasure he derived from outsmarting his victims, and initially the authorities, undoubtedly fed his deeply inflated ego. It became a perverse game to him, a demonstration of his supposed superior cunning and control over others. He didn't perceive his victims as human beings with lives, hopes, and dreams. They were, to him, mere obstacles or disposable resources in his relentless pursuit of personal satisfaction and enrichment. He experienced no emotional connection, no pang of conscience, simply the cold satisfaction of achieving his objective.
The Cyanide Killer case forced a hard, uncomfortable look at how society inadvertently creates vulnerabilities that manipulative individuals can exploit. It really brought to light several key societal pressures and oversights that tragically facilitated Mohan Kumar's decade-long killing spree. For instance, the immense pressure on young women to marry quickly, often seen as the only pathway to social and economic security, made them, tragically easy targets for Mohan Kumar's false promises of a desirable future.
And that's not all. Furthermore, the deeply ingrained tendency for families to initially blame the women for eloping or abandoning them, rather than suspecting foul play, tragically allowed Mohan to operate for years without widespread suspicion. There was a strong cultural stigma associated with a daughter running away for love, which meant families were often ashamed to report or investigate vigorously, inadvertently covering his tracks. And crucially, there was a historical lack of thorough, standardized investigations into unexplained deaths, especially those initially dismissed as suicides or simple disappearances, which meant that the chilling pattern of his crimes went unnoticed for far too long, allowing him to continue his deadly acts.
This case really lays bare some uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? It forces us to ask, what hidden vulnerabilities exist in our own communities, in our own expectations, in our own social norms, that a manipulative individual could exploit?
It absolutely does. This case is a stark reminder that we must question assumptions, push for thoroughness even in seemingly straightforward tragedies, and understand the subtle ways in which societal pressures can be weaponized. On a more practical level, the horrific impact of this case did lead to some tangible and necessary changes. For example, much stricter regulations on cyanide purchases were introduced across India after his arrest, aiming to prevent the casual, untraceable acquisition of such a deadly substance. It forced society to acknowledge the subtle ways in which it can enable crime, not just through outright neglect, but through ingrained social norms and unexamined assumptions.
Mohan Kumar's crimes continue to cast a long, enduring shadow over Karnataka and serve as a chilling cautionary tale for all of us. He was a man who twisted the most fundamental human desires, that yearning for love, for marriage, for stability, for family, into a cruel, inescapable snare. It's a shocking, almost unbelievable contrast. A former primary school teacher, someone who should have nurtured and safeguarded lives, instead systematically destroyed them with cold, remorseless precision. He embodied the ultimate betrayal, taking the very trust he painstakingly cultivated and wielding it as his most potent, deadly weapon.
And this story teaches us an incredibly vital and sobering lesson, that the greatest danger isn't always from the obvious villain, the figure who inspires immediate fear. Sometimes the most profound betrayal, the most insidious threat, comes from the person who seems the most ordinary, the most trustworthy, the most unassuming. It forces us collectively to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. How well do we truly know those around us, and what hidden desires or pathologies might lie beneath the seemingly normal surface?
As you go about your day, maybe just consider how the very structures of trust and societal expectations that we rely on can be twisted and exploited. What can we learn about protecting ourselves and others from the wolves in sheep's clothing, especially when they prey on the most universal and vulnerable of human hopes?
And remember, critical thinking isn't just about analyzing data or facts. It's also about questioning what seems obvious. It's about looking beyond the surface of a person or a situation and being aware of the subtle currents that can shape human behavior, both good and sometimes terrifyingly bad.
We hope this deep dive has offered you a shortcut to being well-informed, with some surprising insights and a new, perhaps unsettling perspective on how truly insidious betrayal can be. This was a challenging but absolutely necessary exploration into the darkest corners of human nature and the complexities of societal vulnerability.
We encourage you to continue your own exploration, to delve deeper into the societal implications and psychological nuances that cases like Mohan Kumar's bring to light. These stories, though incredibly dark, offer invaluable lessons for vigilance and understanding.
Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning.